All right, welcome everybody. It is October 25th, 2018. This is the weekly Kubernetes community meeting. Everything that you're saying is being live streamed to the internet and will be recorded for YouTube in the public, so please be cognizant of that. Today, a small change because of conflicting meetings. We're actually going to have the release team go first. Then we're going to do a cluster API AWS provider demo with Chuck. Then Aaron's got some contributor tips. We have two SIG updates today, one from SIG Docs and the other one from SIG Storage with Saad. And then we'll go into some announcements. And with that, Aish, are you on the call? There she is. Hi.
Yep, just in time.
Perfect.
Thanks for accommodating the release updates first. So in terms of updates, we're slightly light this time, mainly because things are still, they're beginning to ramp up right now. We cut our second alpha yesterday, and there's link to the bits there. And we hit our first milestone, which is the enhancements freeze on Tuesday. So we currently have 34 enhancements tracked and committed for 113, which is great. Thanks to all the SIG leads and feature owners for helping us wrangle that in. Any further additions to this milestone, to this release, means we need to go through a formal exception process. So the link to which is linked there. Considering this is a short stability release, we might not be able to honor any exceptions at this point. Again, considering we just have 2 weeks to slush and 3 weeks to code freeze. But if there is any urgent need, please follow the exception process. And while we get into the coding of things, please also think about tests, doc PRs, and also any release notes that are relevant for your features. As for CI signal, we had a fresh report go out yesterday. Thanks to Cluster Lifecycle and Apps folks for fixing a couple of long-standing issues. We now have upgrade tests not timeout on us perennially, and this is uncovering few other flakes and failures that we are actively tracking for 113. And there's a quick list of test failures that are that will be beta blocking. Good news is there are just a few of them that are showing up in multiple jobs. So ideally, if we fix those, we should get more green runs. And upgrade tests continue to be a little bit flaky. So we are actively following up on deflaking those and actually seeing which are the legit failure signals from those. So that's out for 113. We have 112 patch planned for today, later today. So there's a link to all the PRs there.
Okay, any questions for release? All right, thank you very much. That's it. Next, we're going to do the demo. This is going to be the Cluster API AWS provider with Chuck Ha. Chuck, take it away. You have 10 minutes.
All right. Thanks, George. Before I jump into the demo, I wanted to talk a little bit about Cluster API. And Cluster API is a managed, it's a Kubernetes SIG sponsored project. And the goal of Cluster API is to provide a Kubernetes-like experience for managing clusters, managing Kubernetes clusters. So that means that you'll see things like kubectl create cluster, kubectl delete cluster. And of course, the cluster object has many attributes that you can change so you can get a cluster to your specification. But clusters have to run somewhere, and that's going to be outside the scope of the Cluster API project. So Cluster API is only interested in providing the objects to give you a Kubernetes-like experience, and that's where the provider implementations come in. So I'm doing a demo of the Cluster API provider AWS, which that name should make a little bit more sense now. It's the AWS implementation of Cluster API. And so with that, I will share my screen. Okay. And I wanted to run through some of the tools and requirements that we provide with the Cluster API provider AWS project. So there are a couple of requirements here. The scope of the project focuses on provisioning infrastructure, and also installing Kubernetes onto the provisioned infrastructure. But in AWS world, you need a few more things than that. So one of the requirements we have are the IAM roles and users and groups and things like that. And to that end, we provide a tool because there are quite a number of roles and users that we need. We provide a tool called, this is a great name, Cluster AWS ADM. I'm still not sure how to pronounce that one. I was going with Cluster Ocidum, but I don't know. You can make up your own pronunciation. And that will help you create all of the IAM rules that you need. So there's a command, Cluster AWS ADM alpha bootstrap create stack. And what this does is generate a CloudFormation template and then upload it to your account and create a bunch of things for you. So you'll see here that I've created all of these different resources that are required to run the provider AWS. It went very quickly because I had already done it. The second requirement we have is that you need to have an existing SSH key pair. And I've already created a key pair in the region that I'm going to be using, so we don't have to worry about that. The third requirement is an existing Kubernetes cluster. So Cluster API uses Kubernetes as a deployment platform, which means we need a Kubernetes cluster to get more Kubernetes clusters. That's no worries, we've got a Kubernetes cluster already. So one thing is that it needs to be a relatively recent version of Kubernetes. So you can see I'm using version 1.12.1, but I think 1.11 with the latest patch version will work as well. I'm using Minikube for this, but it doesn't have to be Minikube. It can be any existing Kubernetes cluster. And then the last thing we need are the manifests. So we actually need to generate the CRDs to describe a cluster and to describe machines. So we can run a command make manifests, and that will create a couple of CRDs for us using some tooling through Kube Builder. Oh, and the other thing I forgot to note is that I installed the latest binary releases from the provider AWS project before I started with this. And that is what you need. This is all written down in our docs in the Getting Started guide in the repository. I will link to that in the notes if it's not already. And then there's one last command that we're going to run to actually create a cluster. It's the cluster control workflow. So what that looks like is it's everything you need to get started with Cluster API. So cluster control. So one of the weird things about cluster control is that it has to be packaged with each provider. So I've just named this one cluster control AWS so that I know that this cluster control is working with the AWS provider. And it's got a lot of parameters. So cluster create cluster. We'll say this is a long one, so I'm going to copy and paste it. We're saying that we have an existing bootstrap cluster, and I pass it my kubeconfig. So kubeconfig. And then I give it the generated, then I tell it which provider I'm using. That's provider AWS, apologies for the line break. And then I pass it the list of machines that I want to create. And that's going to live in the generated code. So that this YAML is coming from the make manifest command I ran earlier. Now I pass it the cluster YAML. So this defines the cluster that we're going to be creating. And then I finally pass it the provider components, which are the controllers for responding to actions on the cluster and machine objects. And that's the command. It takes about 7 minutes to run. So I've already started running it before we even got going. And it looks like it's finished. So I just have Windows over so we can see. Oops. Is this still working? Can you still see what this is? The screen share? No? Okay. Let me just share this one again.
Yeah, it looks like it died.
Yeah, I think when I changed tabs, it stopped sharing. Okay, so this is the same command up top. You'll see that I just wrote out, and this one only took six minutes to run, but still too long to run the whole thing. So what this will do is create a bootstrap cluster, but we already have a bootstrap cluster. So really we're reusing an existing bootstrap cluster. These logs are a little bit legacy, but this is creating the controllers for the custom resources that we've defined. And then it provisions the target cluster. So that means it's going out to AWS and creating all of the necessary infrastructure needed to set up a Kubernetes cluster. And then it creates a control plane node. And once that's all finished, it pivots. It does this thing where it pivots. It moves the cluster API from the Bootstrap cluster to the new cluster that you've provisioned, so that it's so that it lives on the managed cluster, so it's managing itself, which is kind of cool. And then it finishes. Right now, there's one little issue that we have where it ends on a fail, but that's not super important because all of the infrastructure is still there. And I can show you, and the output of this command is a kubeconfig file in the local directory. So if I do kubectl, kubeconfig, and I get pods in the kube system namespace, you can see that we've got a whole bunch of nodes running. And so we have one control plane node. There's still a next step of getting worker nodes to join, but that's an issue that's being actively worked on right now. So that is where the project is at. If there are any questions, I would love to take them.
Yep, we have one question already in the chat. And then after that, if anybody wants to ask a question voice or just plop it in the chat. Chris Nova asks, where are the secrets stored? Are they still in those CRD definitions?
Yeah, those are still in the CRD definitions for now. I think something might have changed this past week. I haven't been following too closely for this week. But Jason or Vince can probably answer that. Or if anybody from Scale Factory is on, they can answer as well.
Looks like Josh has a question.
Yeah, that's a really long command line for cluster control.
Sure
is it possible to use a config file?
It might be. So that's part of the Cluster API project. It's provided by the Cluster API project. I'm not sure what the plans are with improving the UX on that.
All right, any other questions or comments? All right, thanks, Chuck. Moving on, we have the contributor tip of the week with Aaron Krickenberger.
Hi, everybody. I'm Aaron of Sigbeard, Aaron Krickenberger, Aaron of Steering Committee, whatever you want to call it. Today, we're going to talk about hold. So hold is this wonderful command. All these are linked in the meeting notes. So this is a command that is supplied by Prow. It lets you apply a label to a pull request that says, please hold this PR and do not actually merge it. You can also see a description for the label in our GitHub labels description thing. And because GitHub's API supports label descriptions, if you were to hover over the label, you could also see that. And it just says, do not hold because somebody has issued a command. I skipped by it real quick, I guess, when I was showing the command to that documentation, but anybody can apply a hold and anybody can remove a hold. You don't have to be a member of the Kubernetes community in order to do either of those things. The idea is it's sort of intended to be a lightweight social thing. Here's me hovering over a hold label in the GitHub search to show the description. We kind of have these label descriptions for most of our GitHub labels. So why would I want to use hold? First, let's talk about some good ideas and bad ideas when it comes to using hold. A good idea, I actually have to go back to the docs for this, I guess. A good idea would be to explain why you are putting a hold on a pull request. So here's an example of a contributor putting a hold on a pull request because they're saying, like, actually, I'm not sure this should merge because we're still seeing flakes, and this is a pull request about merging something that should no longer be flaky. So it's not meeting our criteria. Hold up, I don't think we should do this. Another good example would be a contributor saying, hey, hold up, this PR seems kind of large. We should talk about this in person at a meeting. That's great. A slightly less good thing to do would be to apply a hold without any comment explaining why you're doing it. Although I will say that this is a common pattern you will see in repos such as Kubernetes org and Kubernetes test infra, because We believe that it is important for the PR author to have the final say over when the pull request merges, because usually pull request merging equals something getting deployed and something happening. And so it may be that, if we're adding org members, or we're changing test jobs, or we're rolling out some new piece of functionality to the automation, we believe that it's up to the author to decide when that last final step actually happens. So that's what's going on here. A bad idea, although I said anybody can remove a hold, doesn't matter who you are, we're probably going to frown on people who just randomly go around to any one of the PRs that show up in this search and start removing holds. The idea here is don't be a jerk. Like, it probably doesn't make sense for you to jump into some random PR and remove a hold if you haven't been involved in that PR in any way, shape, or form, or have no context for what's going on in there. But we do want to make sure that this is a really lightweight thing. It's the emergency stop, it's the fire handle, whatever, but it's also really lightweight to remove. And then, like I said, why might you want to do this? Hang on, I, the reviewer, think the PR needs more discussion, or hang on, I, the author, want this held because I have some specific people I want to hear from before I let the PR merge. Or hang on, I, the author or the reviewer, really think it's important that the author have final say on when this merges. We found this label to be incredibly helpful and useful for overcoming some of the trickier corner cases when it comes to, you have a code review process that you want to use awesome automation to have things merge when you're good and ready for them to merge. But we don't have a whole bunch of time to code up this Byzantine structure around approve and LGTM, and now let's add some more labels and all that stuff. So generally, we have found that acting as a human being, talking to people, and using the hold and hold cancel commands has really enabled a lot of excellent organic code review workflows to pop out of the wild. That has been this week's contributor tip. I will stop sharing my screen and ask if there are any questions. No questions that I can see in chat.
You have one from Jeff.
Jeff, you're waving your hand.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself twice since I'm the one streaming. Is there any logic in place in Prow to have like a blacklist? So if someone says, a bad actor goes and unholds all of our PRs, can we blacklist that person's account from doing that further?
We can blacklist that person from the org. That's something that we would, there are people responsible for frontline moderation. If people are posting like inappropriate comments or harassing people, they can be prevented from contributing in any way to any of the repos of the org. And if we do find that this command is getting abused, we're going to have to tighten it up a bit. But
yeah,
I thought that you were saying right now that you didn't have to be an org member to use hold.
You don't, but you can prevent people from interacting with your repo. Like, you do have to be signed into GitHub to interact with it. So if somebody was really determined and wanted to create a whole bunch of troll accounts and then do this, we would probably end up having to lock this down. But thus far, the community has been filled with a lot of not jerks who don't do that. So I really appreciate everybody being kind and human and playing well with each other. Hopefully we can keep it that way and we don't have to lock this down.
And Jennifer points out we do have a code of conduct committee if it ever gets to that point.
We do have a code of conduct committee. This is true. And we don't necessarily rely on them for frontline moderation. We do rely on them for escalation of more serious incidents and the creation of policy that frontline moderation people can enforce.
Okay, any final questions on the whole command? Going once, twice, 3 times. Moving on to our SIG updates. Before we move on to SIG docs, just a reminder there, if you look SIG chairs, if you look at the notes there, we've added a link to a list of recommended topics that you can cover as part of your SIG status. And we also added a template, so like if you want to look snazzy and things like that. And at the top of this document is the schedule on when your SIG is supposed to do its status update at this meeting. So please be cognizant of that. So when a host comes to chase you down, hopefully it does not surprise you. With that, we have SIG docs with Jennifer and Zach. Take it away.
Hello. Let me start sharing my screen and we will give the update for SIG docs. And let me see if I can get into present mode. It may not be possible. Well, let's take it as it lies. So my name is Zach Corlison. I am a contributor to SigBeard. I am also a co-chair for SigDocs. With me today is my co-chair, Jennifer Rondeau. And here's what we did last cycle. We released the 1.12 docs, and many thanks goes to Zach Arnold, who is one of our newer approvers and a brand new Docsmeister for being the Meister for the 1.12 process. I did not link to them here, but Zach ended up creating a couple of really useful tools for the Docsmeistering process that rely on the GitHub GraphQL API to monitor and track all open release-related PRs in progress. As a tool for reducing much stress in terms of tracking. Another thing that we have done in the past recent cycle is that we have updated our internationalization workflows for Kubernetes.io. If you go to Kubernetes.io, you can see now that there is a language selector that is fully populated with the language options currently available. That's not to say that all of that content is there and fully localized, but the infrastructure supporting full localization exists. This is the culmination of about a year's worth of work. It's kind of amazing to be able to say that, given where we started a year ago. Being able to support localization on Kubernetes.io meant in the spring completely migrating the site's static site generator from Jekyll to Hugo, doing all of the cleanup associated with that, and figuring out how to bring all of the localization projects back together under the K website repo in a way that didn't make everyone go crazy in terms of trying to parse out localization PRs. We had initially separated localization projects out into separate repos so that reviewers for pull requests and issues weren't stuck trying to parse PRs in a language that they literally could not understand. We have a great tool for that now, thanks to Prow, and that tool is language labels. And we have added, in owners files, we have added automatic designations for language so that when content in a certain content subfolder, so the sub-content folder for Chinese, for example, Chinese has the 2-letter code of ZH. So whenever content in that sub-content folder is modified, Prow automatically applies a label to the issue language/ZH. And it's possible to filter by language and for reviewers to meaningfully review work with making other languages opaque. So it's very handy. Let's see, we've also updated our localization guidelines, and many thanks especially to the Korean translation project team for the substantial improvements that they offered to not only how they do localization, but how all teams do localization. So Junyi and Claudia King from the Korean translation team get a special shout out. Other projects recently, we have better automation now for generating API reference docs. What that looks like in particular is that we're no longer relying on a container that's no longer being maintained. And we've gotten rid of about, the API docs used to be about 45% blank space. That's no longer the case. A lot of this work goes to, the credit for this goes to Qiming Teng, one of our maintainers from IBM in China. It's awesome work. So the process for generating API reference docs and the output of them is much better now. Other news, Jared Bhatti of Google, who basically got Kubernetes docs rolling as a thing initially. He has stepped down as the SIGDocs co-chair. He is staying on as an approver. So many thanks to Jared for his years of service. Fortunately for us, Jennifer Rondeau at Heptio has stepped up as a new SIGDocs co-chair, and we are very, very fortunate to have her. Plans for upcoming cycles. We have spent the last year sort of working at the fringes of our expertise in terms of automation, tooling support, internationalization, which none of us had ever really done before. We tackled that this year. So we're returning to our core mission on content and the quality of content, and focusing especially on improving our onboarding content for Kubernetes documentation. What that looks like in particular is better onboarding docs through graphical models. Andrew Chen at Google and Dominic Tornov at SAP. Dominic has been given to us as a dedicated resource for 6 months to help add models explaining Kubernetes architecture to the documentation. And there's a link in this presentation. I don't know if you're going to be able to, if folks can see this well enough. Right here, let me add this link in chat. If I can get back to.
I can add it, Zach.
Thank you, Jennifer, I appreciate it. So that's an example of the work in progress. Let's see, other things that are coming up. Tim Fogarty is the Docsmeister for 1.13. He's already off to a great start. We have 2 upcoming doc sprints, one in Shanghai, where we're going to focus specifically on localization workflows. I expect that the Chinese localization team will have a lot of questions about how to do localization with a workflow that's been reconsolidated into K-Website. So we're dedicating our time to making sure that the localization team there has a good face time and as much resources we can give them for learning and getting comfortable with that workflow. Topic for Seattle is TBD. I think we're all just very much in Shanghai mode right now. Looking farther forward in 2019, I think one of the questions that we're looking at is how to ensure that our content remains fresh, instituting some sort of automatic staleness to make sure that content regularly receives review or stales out. So that's very preliminary, but that's something that we're looking at in the farther scope. How these plans affect you? We're really busy. So if you need something, it's better to ask on an interrupt basis, and please feel comfortable doing so. Let's see. Sub-project status. For localization in particular, SIGDocs had 3 different sub-projects, each one dedicated to a specific language. Those have all been consolidated and back into K-Website, and all of those language-specific repositories and sub-project ownerships have been archived and put back into K-Website. So that is once again an integrated workflow within the K-Website repo. Related working group status. So we have a working group now for SIGDocs tooling. We found that tooling was taking up a lot of our time and attention, and that we weren't focusing on content nearly enough. So we have decided to put together a working group that's led by Luke Perkins, and to shunt conversations about tooling and architecture into the working group and let them sort it out. It's pretty ad hoc at the moment, but it's working well. Let's see how you can contribute. So if you are interested in contributing to Kubernetes documentation, there is always a need for technical review to ensure that concepts and tasks remain accurate and up to date. Tutorials as well. anytime that you want to offer a technical review of documentation, please be welcome. And the best way to do that is to open a pull request. You can also take a look at open issues and pick an issue that's relevant to your interests and abilities. The list is, if you visit the repo, the issues link is unexceptional. If you see something incorrect in the documentation, please feel free to open a PR. Anyone can open a PR. You do not have to be a member of Kubernetes org to open a pull request. So feel free to make that fix. And just as a general rule, pull requests tend to get more attention than issues. We would love to be able to have enough folks and contributors to make sure that issues got as much love as pull requests. But in terms of what we can review easily and devote our attention to, pull requests get the majority of our attention. So if you really want to see something get done, open a PR. Let's see where to find us. So the three co-chairs of SigDocs right now are Andrew Chen, Chenopis on GitHub and in Slack, Jennifer Rondeau, Bradamante with a 3 at GitHub, Jay Rondeau in Slack, and myself, Zachary Serra. Our homepage here, you can see more in the community repository for the SigDocs specific page. We've got a link to our Slack channel and a link to our email list. Here endeth.
All right. Any questions for SigDocs?
Sorry.
All right. And if anyone sees Jared today, give him a hug. All right. Moving on. Sig Storage, Mr. Saad Ali.
All right. Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Looks like somebody will need to stop sharing first.
I am working on that. The controls for sharing are non-obvious once they disappear.
There should be just a red button, stop sharing, at the top of the screen.
Alas, there is not, but I will stop my video.
No, I think you're just going to have to quit out of the client and rejoin if you can't find that.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Thanks. All right, there we go. Try it now.
All right, can everyone see my screen? Yeah. All right, so let me go ahead and get started. So I am Saad Ali. I'm one of the SIG leads for SIG Storage. Today I wanted to give you an update on what we've been working on for the last quarter and what our plans are for this quarter and how you can get involved. So last quarter, there was three big projects that we worked on. One was topology-aware volume scheduling. So the idea here is that we want to make the Kubernetes scheduler smarter and more aware of what's going on with storage when it makes a decision for where to schedule your workload. Previously, the way that this worked with some of the entry volume plugins was it was a hard-coded hack for a couple of the cloud providers. So the concepts like zone and region were hard-coded into the scheduler for AWS and GCE. It wasn't generally applicable beyond those two cloud providers. But the concept of topology is more generally applicable. If you're running in an on-premise environment, you could have something like racks as your topology. And there's arbitrary topologies that could exist in any type of environment. What we wanted to do was move towards a model where your storage system could express what the accessible topology it has and expose that information to the scheduler so that the scheduler can make intelligent decisions based on that. We started work on that in 1.10 on the Kubernetes side and on the CSI spec side. And in 1.12, we ended up bridging that with work that went into the sidecar containers between Kubernetes and CSI, so that now CSI drivers have full capability of using volume topology aware scheduling. We're planning on moving that feature to beta this quarter. Another item we were working on for a very long time was snapshot and restore functionality. This work actually started over a year ago, but ran into a bunch of challenges in figuring out how we wanted to integrate it into Kubernetes. Specifically, one was, do we really want this functionality to be part of the Kubernetes API? And the question that we asked ourselves was, what benefit does it give to the end user? What we realized was that a lot of, for example, database administrators would like the ability to be able to create a snapshot before they do some sort of destructive operation. And before this functionality existed, they had to go around Kubernetes to be able to do that. So we realized it was important, but the challenge is that creating a snapshot is very much a declarative operation. And Kubernetes is an imperative operation, and Kubernetes is a declarative API. So figuring out how that would mesh took us some time. In 1.12, we have an alpha release that we're fairly happy with and seems to be well received. Please take a look at that. We posted a blog on Kubernetes.io detailing how all of that works. In addition to that, in 1.12, we also did a lot of work preparing CSI to go to GA and stable in Q4. There are three big functionalities of CSI. One is remote persistent volumes. That's the primary use case for us. This you can think of as NFS or GCE persistent disks or Amazon EBS volumes, volumes that are independent of the local machine. They exist remote and they persist beyond the life cycle of any given pod. That's the primary use case for CSI. Beyond that use case, we also wanted to support ephemeral local volumes. So if you look at the existing volumes that we have in tree, that would be something like the empty dir volume, where there's scratch space basically taken from the local host machine, used temporarily for the pod and deleted. Long term, we want to be able to support that kind of volume as well. And beyond that, we also want to be able to support block volumes. So while the core feature of remote persistent volumes is going to be moving to GA this quarter, what we wanted to do last quarter was make sure that we have plans for these other features and are moving towards getting support for these other features in a way that we don't end up breaking the core functionality. So now that we've gotten to that point, we're going to go ahead and move that core to GA and continue to work on these other features. In addition to CSI moving to GA, we need to start thinking about how to move the current in-tree volume plugins to CSI. The large motivation here is the cloud provider extraction project. We want to get the cloud provider code out of Kubernetes, and the volume plugins for cloud providers are a large part of that. The work here that we did last quarter was to come up with a long-term design for how we're going to do this. The success metric here is a little bit funny. Ideally, end users should not notice that it happened. But once it happens, it would be silent to the end user. They would continue to use the same APIs they're familiar with. Kubernetes under the cover reroutes to CSI. So last quarter, we came up with a design for that. In addition, we're also coming up with reusable libraries for iSCSI and NFS. So if you're writing CSI drivers that use any of those protocols, instead of having to rewrite a complete driver with mount code, you'd be able to start with a library and build only the pieces that are custom for your storage system. We also worked on coming up with a conformance test plan. Kubernetes is focusing a lot more on conformance, and the tests that we had for storage were basically non-existent before 1.12. In 1.12, we focused on coming up with a list of tests that we wanted to add to conformance and getting approval on that. So moving forward, this quarter, the big goal is to get CSI to GA. This is the core functionality of CSI, which is remote persistent volumes. So far, we're on track for that. We have some dependency on the node team with a kubelet device registration mechanism, but we're working with them to get that unblocked. Beyond moving the core functionality of CSI to GA, we're also continuing to drive non-core CSI features. So as I mentioned, ephemeral volumes is a feature that we want to support, and we want to move the features for that to beta this quarter. We're also going to be moving CSI topology support to beta this quarter, and we're going to work on figuring out how to do automatic installation of the CRDs that these features depend on. For those of you who are not aware, there's a big push to move away from adding additional built-in APIs into Kubernetes, even for features that core Kubernetes functionality depends on. We're moving to a model where those APIs are going to be CRDs. This introduces some challenges, including how are those CRDs that core Kubernetes components depend on, how are they going to be installed? And traditionally, with the built-in API types, you don't have to worry about the API type disappearing and reappearing. Whereas with a CRD, a user could accidentally delete a core CRD that a core component depends on. So there's a lot of work beyond SIG storage to try and figure out how that process should work. SIG cluster lifecycle and SIG API machinery are helping us with that. For the short term, we're going to use the add-on manager for Kubernetes as a workaround and unblock SIG storage. Longer term, we're going to work with the other SIGs to figure that out next quarter. We're also starting to implement the plan for migrating CSI entry volumes to CSI. So we did the planning last quarter, and this quarter we're aiming to have an alpha implementation. It would be disabled by default. We would get the code ready and begin to test. And then this is going to be a multi-quarter effort of actually moving to a point where the default Kubernetes installation will go ahead and automatically use CSI drivers rather than the entry drivers. And eventually we can deprecate the entry code. Of course, we can't deprecate the API, but we can have the functionality move to CSI. We're also moving entry block volume support to beta. This feature has languished in alpha for multiple quarters. And there's a big push to get it to beta this quarter. Beyond that, the iSCSI, NFS, and Fiber Channel libraries I was talking about, we're finding new homes, new repos for those, and continuing to work on them. We're also extracting the mount library that exists inside Kubernetes. Kubernetes used by a lot of the common volume code into a separate repo so that CSI drivers can also leverage that library. A lot of that code is shared. And we're continuing to drive on conformance testing. So we came up with a plan last quarter, and this quarter we're starting to implement a lot of the tests for conformance. So that's a summary of what the SIG has been working on. If you are interested in getting involved, we hold bi-weekly meetings. We had one this morning at 9 a.m. We'll have another one in 2 weeks. Go to that link to find out more, and feel free to add anything to the agenda at any point. We have a Slack channel and a mailing list if you have any questions. We tend to be pretty responsive there, and we're going to have a pretty large presence at KubeCon Seattle. There's going to be a SIG storage intro that I believe I'll be leading. If not, Brad Childs from Red Hat may lead that. It's just if you're unfamiliar with what the SIG does, we'll introduce that and how you can get involved. There's going to be a container native storage day, which is planned for the day before the conference, which will be a number of sessions related to cloud native storage. There is also a CNCF storage work group that has been working on creating a white paper defining what storage looks like in the CNCF landscape. They had an earlier attempt at this about a year ago, which resulted in a lot of controversy because it was focused on what is CNCF, what storage systems are CNCF, what storage systems are not, and kind of making recommendations, which given the diversity of all the different types of storage systems out there, ended up being very controversial. In this iteration, they have an explicit non-goal to not have any recommendations for storage or try to define what is or is not CNCF. or cloud native, and it's more about here's the landscape of what storage looks like today. So if you're interested in that at all, the CNCF storage work group is going to be presenting that at KubeCon. We also have a number of storage talks from folks in the storage SIG. Please feel free to attend those. That is all. Any questions?
I have a question about the CRD auto install and using the, I believe, deprecated add-on manager to unblock big storage. My main concern would be around upgrade, and if it goes wrong, downgrade of clusters that are going through that life cycle. So I would encourage you to think through that very carefully.
So the functionality that CSI is depending on for the CRDs is currently alpha, moving to beta this quarter. The functionality that CSI has that's moving to GA doesn't depend on CRDs. And the criteria that we have to move the functionality from beta to GA, one of the criteria will be to have a more robust CRD installation mechanism and ensure that we handle the race conditions. Any other questions? All right.
All right. Thanks, Saad. I'm interested in comments in the chat. Both SIGs kind of gave an update with like this new format with the new slides. Please let us know if you like it, +1, -1. I really kind of enjoyed the summary that both SIGs gave there, so I think that's a plus. Okay, moving on to the announcements. 2-week warning, the Meter Contributor session is going to be November 7th at 2:30 p.m. and 8 p.m. That's in UTC time. The 2:30 p.m. UTC time is for the 5 steering committees. AMA, that stands for Ask Me Anything. You basically show up and ask the steering committee all sorts of questions. Those sessions are pretty popular on YouTube, so I recommend that you attend that. And then the second session is contributor mentors. You can ask them anything as well. You can always find Paris at #meetourcontributors on Slack, and there's a link there to the YouTube playlist if you want to see any of the past sessions. Final call from Ihor for the CNCF Awards. The nominations are still open. Follow the link, and those awards are the ones that are presented during KubeCon. The Kubernetes Contributor Summit details. For Shanghai, the Contributor Social has been scheduled. It's going to be from 6 to 8, November 13th at the Convention Center. The event will feature a panel of Chinese contributors for Kubernetes discussing obstacles and opportunities. Josh, anything to add about KubeCon Shanghai?
That's all the news this week.
Okay.
that is current contributor activity. And I actually just realized I got the times wrong because we changed them. It's actually from 5 to 7, so I'll fix that in the notes.
Okay, thank you, sir. Moving on to Seattle, registration is closed and a wait list is in effect. We are basically full up to like the fire code. So if it ends up, those of you that are attending, if it ends up you can't attend for some reason, please let us know in the Contributor Summit Slack channel, or just reach out to myself or Paris or Bob, and we'll sort it, because we have a wait list of people that really want to get in, and unfortunately we're running into physical limitations of the space. So please help us out if you can there. As always, if you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to us. A lot of shout outs this week. I'm going to try to get through them as fast as I can. Phil Whitrock would like to shout out to Alexis MP, Jiffy, and Mr. Bobby Tables for helping me with all things Open Cube Builder Workshop. Thank you so much. Aish would like to shout out to Nick Open for automating the issues in PR spreadsheet for bug triage and CI signal for 1.13. Thanks for staying on top of this and accommodating the feature requests. Josh Burkus would like to thank Justin Santa Barbara for splitting out our long-time running upgrade tests so that they actually complete. Aaron would like to thank Ben the Elder for creating a PR that deletes over 3 million lines of code. Everybody clap. Touching over 6,500 files. Aaron would also like to shout out to XD for setting things up so we can use shorter URLs for testgrid.kates.io and gubernator.kates.io. Noah Abrahams would like to shout out to IdealHack for translating a huge pile of slides in preparation for the new contributor workshop in Shanghai. Kenny Coleman, I think I got that right. Shout out to Aish, Spiffx, at C. Lawrence, Guinevere, and Amukem. I hope I get that right, for their help on getting all the K/features issues in great spot where everything is now being tracked to a PR in Kubernetes and getting the freeze over the finish line. Aish says, Kenny, right back at you. Awesome job on doing all the heavy lifting yourself, staying on top of 50 incoming enhancements, following up the printing list, and mentoring the shadows at the same time is no easy feat. And Nikita would like to shout out to Lucas for being extremely responsive for feature requests for DevStats and implementing them and fixing bugs really quickly. I echo that as well. Lucas, great job. And lastly, the Stack Overflow top users for the month are Rico, Praveen Srivati, Ijaz Khan, sorry about that one, Ryan Dawson, Sam Hain, 1138, Von C, Michael Hassenblas, David Mays, Ignacio Milan, and Konstantin Vustin. As always, we highly encourage contributors to check out the Kubernetes tag on Stack Overflow to help users out. And with that, any other topics or issues, or we break 10 minutes early? Opening up the floor, anything? Jeffrey would like to add community meeting November 22nd. I believe that falls on Thanksgiving week for the US. I know in the past we have canceled meetings for US holidays, but this year we're kind of thinking that we don't want to be so US centric. So we're looking, we have a month to figure out whether we can have a meeting during Thanksgiving US. So Europeans or people in Asia or something, if you want to work with us to kind of put together an agenda to have a meeting so we can unblock from having this whole thing have to happen in the US, please see us in SIG Contributor Experience and we can work something out. Anybody else? Going once? Going twice? All right. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see everyone next week. You have 9 minutes back.